High above the world, beneath the celestial river of stars, an ancient dragon watches in silence. This is the story of the Dragon of Peace, whose quiet presence keeps harmony between heaven and earth. The celestial river above the world. Long before memory, before the first words were written or the first song sung, there existed above the world a river unlike any other. This was not a river of water in the way mortals understand water, though it flowed and shimmered and moved with the patience of eternal currents. This was the celestial river, the great luminous band that stretched across the night sky from one horizon to the other, a pathway of stars so numerous that together they appeared as flowing light. To those who lived on earth below, the celestial river was known by many names. Some called it the Silver River, for the way its light resembled molten silver poured across black silk. Others called it the River of Heaven, believing it to be the path along which divine beings traveled between the celestial palace and the mortal realm. Still others simply called it the Star River, acknowledging its nature without claiming to fully understand it. But whatever name they gave it, all who looked upon the celestial river felt the same quiet awe. There was something about its presence that inspired contemplation rather than excitement, peace rather than wonder. It did not demand attention the way a shooting star might, blazing briefly across the darkness. Instead, it simply existed, constant and serene, night after night, season after season, year after year, flowing through the darkness with a patience that suggested it had always been there and would always remain. The river was widest in the summer months, when the nights were warm and people would lie on their backs in fields or on rooftops, watching the stars drift slowly overhead. In winter, when the air was cold and crisp, the river seemed brighter somehow, its light sharper against the frozen darkness. But in all seasons, it maintained its essential character, that quality of flowing stillness, of movement so gradual it seemed almost like permanence. Those who studied the stars carefully noticed that the celestial river was not uniform in its brightness. There were regions where the stars clustered more densely, where the light intensified into pools of particular radiance. There were other stretches where the stars scattered more loosely, where darkness showed through the gaps like water between floating lanterns. These variations gave the river its character, its texture, its sense of being not just light but a living presence woven from countless individual points of illumination. The ancient scholars and astronomers mapped these patterns, giving names to the clusters and configurations they observed. They noted the way certain stars seemed to form shapes, a bridge here, a gate there, formations that suggested purpose and design rather than random scattering. They developed theories about the river's nature, debated whether it was near or far, whether the stars that composed it were similar to the sun or fundamentally different in their essence. But beyond all the scholarly study and careful observation, beyond the maps and measurements and mathematical calculations, there remained something about the celestial river that resisted complete understanding. Something that suggested the eye saw only the surface, that the light visible from Earth was merely the manifestation of something deeper, more complex, more profound. This was the truth that lived in folklore rather than astronomy, in stories told by firelight rather than in texts written with careful brushstrokes. This was the knowledge that said the celestial river was not merely a collection of distant stars but an actual river, flowing through dimensions that mortal senses could only partially perceive. A river with depth and current, with hidden places beneath its luminous surface, with mysteries that dwelt in regions no earthly eye could penetrate. In these old stories, passed down through generations of grandmothers and grandfathers who spoke in quiet voices as children drifted toward sleep, the celestial river was described as a boundary. Not a barrier in the sense of something that blocked or prevented, but a boundary in the deeper sense, a place where one realm ended and another began, where the laws of earth gave way to the laws of heaven, where the temporary nature of mortal existence met the eternal patterns of the cosmos. To cross the celestial river, the story said, was to pass from one mode of being into another. Souls of the departed were said to travel along its currents, moving from earthly life to whatever lay beyond. Divine messengers used it as a pathway, descending from the heavens to deliver wisdom or warnings, then ascending again along its luminous flow. The river itself was said to carry power, to radiate a kind of energy that influenced the world below in ways both subtle and profound. But the most persistent stories, the ones told with the most reverence and the most careful attention, spoke of what dwelt beneath the celestial river's surface. For if the river had depth, if it was more than merely light scattered across the darkness, then that depth must contain something. And what could exist in such a place, in the hidden currents beneath the stars, in the secret spaces where celestial water flowed? The answer, according to the oldest tales, was spirits. Great beings who existed outside the normal constraints of mortality and divinity, creatures who were neither gods nor demons but something else entirely, ancient, powerful, and fundamentally aligned with the deep patterns of existence. These spirits, it was said, made their homes in the celestial river's depths, dwelling in regions that touched both heaven and earth but belonged fully to neither. They were guardians, these spirits. Keepers of balance. Watchers who ensured that the boundary between realms remained intact, that the flow of celestial energy continued unimpeded, that the great patterns which governed the relationship between sky and earth maintained their proper configuration. They were not rulers or judges, for such roles implied interference and control. Rather, they were presences, beings whose very existence helped maintain the harmony of all things. The nature of this great spirit was described in different ways by different storytellers, but certain elements remained constant across all tellings. It was vast, larger than any earthly creature could be, its scale matching the river itself. It was ancient, having witnessed the turning of countless ages, the rise and fall of dynasties, the slow transformation of the world below. And it was peaceful, embodying not the fierce power of storms or earthquakes but the deeper power of stillness, of balance maintained through perfect understanding rather than force. The wise ones, those who meditated beneath the stars and opened their awareness to the subtle patterns of existence, sometimes claimed they could sense this great spirit's presence. Not as something visible or audible, but as a quality in the air, a resonance that touched something deep within the human heart. On nights when the celestial river shone with particular clarity, when the air was still and the world seemed to hold its breath, these sensitive souls would speak of feeling watched over, protected, held in a benevolent attention that asked nothing but offered everything. Children hearing these stories would ask, "What is the spirit? What does it look like? Does it have a name?" And the storytellers would smile and shake their heads, not because they wished to be mysterious but because some truths resist simple answering. The spirit beneath the celestial river, they would say, is what it needs to be. It appears as it must appear. And names, which give humans power over the named, have no hold on beings of such ancient nature. Better to think of it as a presence, a protection, a peace that flows through the river above and influences the world below. But pressed further, late in the night when the fire had burned low and the boundaries between waking and sleeping had grown thin, some storytellers would lean close and whisper the oldest name of all, the one that appeared in the most ancient texts, carved in characters so archaic that only scholars could read them. Dragon. Not the dragons of battle and conquest, not creatures of fire and fury, but the dragon of the deep places, the dragon of flowing water and patient watching, the dragon whose power came not from destruction but from perfect, unshakable peace. The dragon of peace, dwelling beneath the celestial river, maintaining the balance between heaven and earth, watching over the world with eyes that had seen the beginning of time and would see its ending, if ending there ever was to be. This was the truth that lived above the world, flowing through the night sky, visible as light but existing as so much more. The celestial river, with its hidden depths and its ancient guardian, with its boundaries that were also connections, with its distance that was also intimacy. And every night, as darkness fell and the stars emerged one by one until the river once again stretched across the heavens, that truth remained. Constant and patient and endlessly serene. The celestial river flowed. The dragon watched. And the world below rested, held in a peace so deep that most never knew its source, protected by a guardian so still that motion itself seemed unnecessary, blessed by a balance so perfect that it felt like the natural order of things rather than something actively maintained. This was the world above the world, the river above all rivers, the peace beneath all peace. And this is where the story truly begins. The dragon who guarded the waters. Beneath the visible flow of the celestial river, in depths that existed between dimensions rather than in any measurable space, there dwelt the dragon. He had no name in the way that mortals understood names, for he had existed before language, before the need to distinguish one thing from another through words. But if one were to describe his essence, his purpose, his fundamental nature, it would be this: he was the guardian of waters, the keeper of balance, the embodiment of peace that underlies all existence. The dragon was vast. Not vast in the way a mountain is vast, with measurable height and width and mass, but vast in a way that transcended physical dimension. His body stretched through the hidden currents of the celestial river, coiling through spaces that mortal geometry could not describe. If he were to fully manifest in the visible realm, his form would span from one horizon to the other, his scales reflecting starlight across the entire breadth of the night sky. But such manifestation was unnecessary. The dragon existed primarily in the depths, in the flowing darkness beneath the river's luminous surface, where his presence maintained the essential balance without need for display or demonstration. He was there in the way that gravity is there, fundamental, constant, so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of existence that his absence would be immediately catastrophic even if his presence went unnoticed. His body was serpentine, following the ancient form that dragons had held since the beginning of time. Long and sinuous, capable of coiling and uncoiling in patterns that matched the currents of celestial water, flowing with the river rather than against it. He had no wings, for flight was unnecessary to one who lived in currents that carried him wherever balance required his presence. He had no legs in the earthly sense, though he possessed the idea of legs, the potential for them, appendages that could manifest when needed but remained mostly as possibility rather than actuality. His scales were like jade, the pale, luminous jade that seems to glow from within, that holds light rather than merely reflecting it. Each scale was perfectly shaped, overlapping with its neighbors in patterns that suggested both intention and inevitability, as if his form had been designed by the same principles that arranged the stars themselves. The scales were smooth but not slick, cool but not cold, solid but somehow permeable, existing in that paradoxical state that characterized so much about the dragon's nature. Between the scales, in the spaces where one plate met another, there ran lines of deeper color, green like the heart of ancient forests, blue like the deepest ocean trenches, purple like the sky at the moment between day and night. These colors shifted subtly as the dragon moved, creating patterns that were never quite the same from one moment to the next, yet always maintaining an essential harmony. To watch these patterns flow across his vast body would be to understand something fundamental about beauty, about change within constancy, about infinite variation that never departed from perfect balance. The dragon's head was long and noble, shaped more like a horse's than a serpent's, with a broad forehead that suggested intelligence and contemplation. His snout was graceful rather than fierce, ending not in razor teeth meant for tearing but in a mouth that seemed designed more for tasting the currents, for sensing the subtle flavors of celestial water that carried information about the state of balance throughout the cosmos. His eyes were what marked him most clearly as something beyond ordinary understanding. They were large and luminous, colored like pools of liquid moonlight, silver-white with depths that seemed to contain entire universes. When the dragon opened his eyes fully, which he rarely did, for much of his watching required no physical sight, they emitted a gentle radiance that illuminated the hidden depths of the celestial river, revealing currents and eddies that otherwise remained invisible even to celestial vision. But more remarkable than their appearance was the quality of attention those eyes contained. The dragon's gaze held no judgment, no preference, no desire for things to be other than they were. It was pure observation, pure awareness, the kind of seeing that accepted everything without needing to change anything. When the dragon looked upon the world, and he looked upon it constantly, even when his eyes were closed, he saw not what was good or bad, right or wrong, but simply what was, in all its complexity and simplicity, all its pain and beauty, all its temporary manifestations and eternal patterns. Along the dragon's spine, running from his head to the tip of his tail, there grew a mane unlike any earthly hair. It was more like flowing water made visible, like captured current given form. The strands moved constantly, stirred by currents that no wind could match, flowing backward along his body as he moved forward through the celestial depths. The mane was colorless and all colors simultaneously, catching light that wasn't there and refracting it into subtle rainbows that existed for moments before dissolving back into pure luminescence. The dragon's tail was long, impossibly long, trailing through the celestial river's currents like a ribbon of living jade. At its tip, the tail broadened into a fin-like structure that the dragon used for the subtlest adjustments to his position, tiny movements that influenced vast regions of the river, that sent ripples through the celestial flow which manifested in the world below as weather patterns, as seasonal shifts, as the gentle progression of time itself. But for all his vastness, for all his power and presence, the dragon was not a creature of action in the way mortals understood action. He was not a warrior defending territory, not a hunter seeking prey, not even a shepherd actively guiding his flock. He was something more fundamental than these roles. He was balance itself, given form and awareness, existing not to do but to be, maintaining harmony through his very presence rather than through any deliberate intervention. The dragon's nature was peaceful in a way that went beyond mere absence of conflict. It was the peace of deep water, of ancient stone, of forces so fundamental that they needed no assertion to maintain their influence. It was the peace of perfect equilibrium, where all forces balanced so completely that movement became unnecessary, where stillness was not the absence of motion but its most refined expression. He had witnessed the birth of stars and their slow fading into darkness. He had watched as worlds formed and cooled, as life emerged and evolved, as civilizations rose and fell like waves on an endless shore. He had seen the patterns repeat, not exactly, for nothing ever repeated exactly, but with sufficient similarity that he understood the deep rhythms, the underlying structures that governed all change and growth and dissolution. This long witnessing had given the dragon a perspective that transcended preference. He did not favor day over night, summer over winter, life over death. He understood that all these opposites were necessary, that each defined the other, that balance required the full spectrum from one extreme to its opposite. His role was not to push the world toward light or darkness, growth or decay, but to ensure that the movements between these poles occurred smoothly, that the transitions maintained their proper rhythm, that no force dominated so completely that balance was lost. The dragon rarely moved in any dramatic sense. His existence was characterized by stillness punctuated by the most subtle adjustments. He would float in the celestial currents, his body perfectly aligned with the flow, moving with the river rather than through it. Days would pass, or what corresponded to days in the timeless realm he inhabited, without any change in his position, any visible sign that he was even alive rather than some vast sculpture of jade suspended in flowing darkness. But this stillness was not inactivity. Within it, constant work was being done. The dragon's awareness extended throughout the entire length of the celestial river, sensing every current, every eddy, every subtle variation in the flow. He felt the pull of distant celestial bodies, the influence of cosmic forces too subtle for mortal instruments to detect, the complex interplay of energies that maintained the boundary between heaven and earth. When adjustment was needed, the dragon provided it with movements so small they were almost imperceptible. A slight shift in the angle of his body would redirect a current. A gentle exhalation would stir stagnant regions back into flow. A slow sweep of his tail would smooth out turbulence before it could propagate into larger disruptions. These tiny interventions, perfectly timed and precisely calibrated, maintained the equilibrium that allowed the celestial river to flow smoothly, season after season, age after age. The dragon's breath was not fire, as lesser dragons breathed. It was something more subtle, more profound. It was the breath of balance itself, exhaled as mist that carried the essence of harmony into whatever region required it. When the dragon breathed out, clouds would form in the atmosphere of the world below, gentle clouds that brought not storms but the soft rain that nurtured growth without causing floods. When he breathed in, he drew back the excess moisture, preventing stagnation, maintaining the circulation that kept water flowing through its eternal cycle. His voice, on the rare occasions when he used it, was not a roar or a shout but something closer to the deep resonance of a temple bell, a sound felt more than heard, vibrating through dimensions that human ears could not directly perceive. The sound carried information, wisdom, a kind of teaching that bypassed words and entered directly into the awareness of those capable of receiving it. It was the voice of deep time, of patterns that transcended individual moments, of truths too fundamental to be expressed in language. But the dragon spoke rarely, for speech implies the need to communicate, and the dragon's presence communicated more effectively than any words could. Those who were sensitive to such things, the mystics and meditators, the children not yet fully bound by rational thought, the dying who stood at the threshold between worlds, could sense his presence without any deliberate communication on his part. They felt watched over, protected, held in a benevolent attention that asked nothing of them but silently ensured that the cosmic order maintained its balance around them. The dragon had no desires in the mortal sense. He did not hunger or thirst, did not seek pleasure or avoid pain, did not hope for the future or regret the past. He existed entirely in the eternal present, in the constant now that was his natural state. But if one could say he had any preference at all, it was for stillness over turbulence, for harmony over chaos, for the smooth flow of celestial currents over their disruption. This was not because harmony was good and chaos was bad. The dragon held no such judgments. It was simply that harmony was his nature, his function, his reason for being. Chaos had its place in the cosmic order, its necessary role in breaking down what needed to dissolve so that new forms could emerge. But the celestial river was meant to flow smoothly, and the dragon's presence ensured that it did so, that chaos expressed itself where it belonged, in the world of constant change below, while the eternal patterns above remained stable and serene. The dragon of peace, dwelling beneath the celestial river, guardian of the boundary between heaven and earth, keeper of the balance that allowed both realms to exist in their proper relationship. Vast and ancient and fundamentally benevolent, not through any moral choice but through the simple fact of his nature, his being, his perfect alignment with the principles of harmony that undergirded all existence. He coiled in the hidden depths, his jade scales catching light that came from no visible source, his eyes half closed in the contentment of perfect balance, his breath stirring the celestial waters with exhalations of mist that would become clouds in the world below. He was there. He had always been there. He would always be there. And in his presence, the celestial river flowed smoothly, the stars maintained their courses, and the world below turned through its seasons in the rhythm that all life depended upon. The dragon of peace. Guardian. Balance. Home. The dragon's quiet nature. Time passed differently in the depths beneath the celestial river. What mortals experienced as the relentless march of moments, each second following the last in strict succession, each day yielding inevitably to night, existed there as something more fluid, more permeable. The dragon inhabited this timeless time, moving through it as he moved through the celestial currents, with a grace that made no distinction between stillness and motion, between now and then, between being and becoming. To watch the dragon, if any I could perceive him in his hidden realm, would be to witness movement so slow it bordered on motionlessness. His great body, coiled through the invisible depths, shifted position over periods that might span days or weeks or even months by mortal measure. A subtle adjustment of his spine, gradually unfolding over what would be hours in the world below. A gentle turn of his head, accomplished so slowly that no single moment showed any difference from the moment before, yet accumulated over time into a complete change of orientation. This slowness was not laziness or lethargy. It was precision. It was the understanding that rapid movement created turbulence, that sudden change disrupted the very balance he existed to maintain. The dragon moved as deep water moves, with an inexorability that came not from speed but from massive, patient force, from the accumulated momentum of vast quantities shifting according to principles more fundamental than urgency. His scales, those plates of luminous jade that covered his impossible length, reflected light in ways that seemed to defy the darkness of his realm. Each scale caught and held the subtle glow that emanated from the celestial river above, transforming it into something deeper, richer, more complex. The light seemed to sink into the scales, to travel through layers of translucent jade before re-emerging with added depth, with colors that hadn't been there before, hints of green like new leaves, touches of blue like mountain lakes, traces of purple like twilight clouds. The pattern of these reflections created a kind of music, though not music that could be heard with ears. It was a visual symphony, a constantly shifting arrangement of light and shadow that played across the dragon's body in rhythms that corresponded to cosmic cycles. When certain stars reached particular positions in their eternal dance, the dragon's scales would brighten in specific regions, creating patterns that those with eyes to see them would recognize as language, as communication, as the written record of balance maintained and harmony preserved. Between the larger scales, in the spaces where jade plates overlapped and connected, there grew smaller scales, each one perfect in its miniature form. These created a texture, a subtle roughness that caught the currents as the dragon moved, that allowed him to sense the flow around him with exquisite precision. Every eddy, every variation in temperature or density or luminosity registered in these sensitive regions, providing the dragon with information about the state of the celestial waters, about where balance was maintained and where adjustment might be needed. The dragon's mane, that flowing cascade of water made visible that ran along his spine, moved constantly with currents that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The individual strands flowed backward as he drifted forward, or sometimes they flowed forward as he drifted backward, or sometimes they moved in complex patterns that suggested he was actually moving in multiple directions at once. His vast body, existing partially in dimensions where forward and backward, up and down, had meanings different from their mortal definitions. Watching the mane flow was hypnotic, meditative. The strands never tangled, never knotted, never caught on each other despite their constant motion. They moved with the same inevitable grace that characterized everything about the dragon, following paths that seemed both random and perfectly choreographed, creating temporary patterns that dissolved and reformed endlessly, like water finding new configurations while remaining essentially water. The dragon's eyes, when open, gazed out across the hidden depths with an attention that was both focused and diffuse. He did not look at things in the way mortal creatures looked, fixing his sight on one object to the exclusion of others. Instead, his vision encompassed everything simultaneously, taking in the whole of his realm without losing awareness of any individual part. He saw the flow of currents throughout the celestial river's entire length. He saw the subtle interactions between different streams of celestial water. He saw the places where energy accumulated and the places where it dispersed. But more often, his eyes were closed, or nearly closed, open just enough that a sliver of moonlight-colored iris showed between his lids. This was his natural state, this half-seeing, half-dreaming condition where physical sight gave way to deeper perception. With his eyes closed, the dragon saw more, not less. He perceived the underlying patterns, the mathematical beauty of balance, the geometries of harmony that governed the relationship between all things. In this state, the dragon appeared to be sleeping, or meditating, or simply existing in some mode between consciousness and unconsciousness. His body would settle into the currents, finding a position where he floated without effort, where the flow supported him perfectly, where no adjustment was needed. He would remain like this for long periods, so still that he might be mistaken for a formation of jade somehow suspended in water, a geological feature rather than a living being. But stillness, for the dragon, was a form of intense activity. In these periods of apparent rest, his awareness extended furthest, his perception deepened most profoundly, his connection to the cosmic balance became most intimate. He felt the turning of planets in their orbits. He sensed the slow burn of stars converting matter into light. He perceived the birth of new souls entering the world below and the departure of old souls leaving it, each arrival and departure creating subtle ripples in the fabric of existence that the dragon registered and accommodated. When the dragon breathed, the motion was almost imperceptible. His great chest would expand over the course of minutes, drawing in celestial water that entered through his nostrils and traveled through channels in his body that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The water, if it could be called water, this substance that was more idea than matter, carried with it information, energy, the essence of whatever region it came from. The dragon processed this information automatically, his body acting as a kind of filter, extracting what needed to be extracted, transforming what needed transformation. Then, equally slowly, he would exhale. The breath emerged from his nostrils as mist, as barely visible wisps of vapor that carried the dragon's essence out into the celestial currents. This mist was balance made manifest, harmony given form, the dragon's nature expressed as substance. Where it flowed, turbulence smoothed. Where it settled, discord resolved into peace. The mist would drift through the celestial river's depths, gradually rising toward the surface, eventually breaking through into the visible realm where it would become clouds in the atmosphere of the world below. These were the clouds that brought gentle rain, that shaded fields from excessive sun, that created the soft light of overcast days when harsh brightness would have been too much. These were the clouds that morning mist condensed from, that evening fog formed from, that mountain valleys filled with on quiet dawns. They were gifts from the dragon, though he thought nothing of giving them, for giving was simply what he did, what his breath naturally accomplished without intention or effort. The dragon's tail, trailing through the depths behind him, moved with its own subtle rhythm. While his head and body might remain nearly motionless, his tail would sway gently, drawing patterns in the celestial water that corresponded to patterns in the world below. When the tail swept left, certain regions of Earth would receive favorable winds. When it swept right, other regions would experience the same blessing. The movements were never large, never dramatic, but their effects accumulated, creating weather patterns that seemed random to those who experienced them but which actually followed the dragon's careful choreography. At the very tip of the tail, that fin-like structure that broadened out from the narrow end, membranes of translucent jade caught the currents like sails, allowing the dragon to make the most delicate adjustments to his position. A tiny flexing of these membranes, invisible to any but the most perceptive observer, could shift the dragon's alignment by the smallest fraction of a degree. But in a being of such vast scale, even the smallest shift had significant consequences, redirecting flows, altering patterns, maintaining balance through adjustments so precise they approached the miraculous. The dragon made sounds, though calling them sounds seemed inadequate. They were more like vibrations, frequencies that propagated through the celestial waters and resonated with fundamental structures of reality. Low tones, felt more than heard, that had the quality of distant thunder or deep bells or the lowest notes of instruments that had never been built. These sounds occurred rarely, usually when some major adjustment was needed, when the dragon's presence alone was insufficient and he needed to actively communicate intention into the fabric of existence. When these deep tones sounded, they traveled far. They passed through the celestial river's depths, through the boundary between realms, down into the world below where they were perceived not as sounds but as feelings. A sense of peace settling over a troubled land. A sudden easing of tension in conflicts that had seemed intractable. A moment of clarity for those struggling with difficult decisions. These were the dragon's voice, speaking not in words but in direct influence, touching the hearts of those below with the same gentle force that moved celestial currents. But mostly, the dragon was silent. His presence spoke louder than any voice, his stillness communicated more than any sound. He existed as a constant, as a reliable foundation upon which the more changeable aspects of existence could safely build. The celestial river flowed above him and around him. The stars followed their courses. The world below turned through its cycles. And through all of it, the dragon maintained his watch, his slow movements and subtle adjustments, ensuring that the great patterns continued, that balance prevailed, that peace remained possible even in a universe of constant change. To exist as the dragon existed was to know a kind of peace that transcended circumstance. Not the peace of absence, no conflict, no challenge, no difficulty, but the peace of perfect presence, of being exactly where one needed to be, doing exactly what one needed to do, aligned so completely with purpose that no doubt or question ever arose. This was the peace the dragon embodied, the peace his nature expressed, the peace that radiated from him into the realms both above and below. His jade scales continued their subtle shimmer. His mane flowed with eternal currents. His eyes remained half-closed in meditation that was also vigilance. His breath stirred the waters with patient rhythm. His tail drew invisible patterns in the darkness. And time continued its fluid passage, neither fast nor slow but simply progressing, carrying the dragon and all of existence forward through the eternal now that was the only time that truly existed, the only moment that ever was or would be. The dragon drifted in the depths beneath the celestial river, vast and ancient and utterly peaceful, a presence so fundamental that to imagine the cosmos without him was to imagine water without wetness, light without illumination, existence without being. He was there. He had always been there. He would always be there. Quiet. Still. Perfect. Complete. The world below the stars. From his position beneath the celestial river, suspended in the flowing darkness between heaven and earth, the dragon gazed downward. His perception penetrated through layers of existence that separated his realm from the mortal world, through celestial waters and atmospheric boundaries, through clouds and air, down to the surface of the earth itself where the lives of countless beings unfolded in their brief, intense spans. The world below was beautiful in its way, though its beauty was different from the timeless perfection of the celestial realm. It was a beauty of constant change, of seasons turning, of growth and decay, of patterns that repeated but never exactly, of infinite variation within the framework of natural law. Where heaven was eternal, earth was temporal. Where heaven was unchanging, earth transformed continuously. And it was this very temporality, this constant flux, that gave the mortal realm its particular character, its poignant intensity. The dragon saw the great mountains that rose from the earth like the bones of the world itself, their peaks touching the lower edges of clouds, their slopes covered in forests that changed color with the seasons. In summer, the mountains wore deep green, the forests thick with life. In autumn, the greens gave way to reds and golds, to oranges and browns, the trees releasing their leaves in preparation for the dormant time. In winter, snow blanketed the peaks and upper slopes, turning the mountains white and still, sleeping under their frozen covering. And in spring, the snow melted, feeding streams that became rivers, and new green emerged from the warming earth, the cycle beginning again. These mountains were old by mortal reckoning, having stood for millennia, their stone weathered by wind and rain and the slow grinding of ice. But to the dragon, who had witnessed the mountains' birth, who had seen them rise from tectonic forces over eons, They were young things, still growing, still finding their final form. He remembered when these peaks were mere hills, and before that, when they were flat plains, and before that, when they lay beneath ancient seas. The dragon's perception of time allowed him to see the mountains not as static objects but as slow waves of stone, rising and falling over periods too vast for human comprehension. Between the mountains, rivers flowed. The dragon watched these rivers with particular attention, for water was his domain, his element, his natural affinity. He saw how the rivers began as small springs high in the mountains, water emerging from stone, gathering in pools before beginning its downward journey. He watched the streams join together, becoming brooks, becoming creeks, becoming rivers that grew wider and deeper as they descended toward the plains. The rivers carved the landscape, patiently wearing away stone, creating valleys and gorges, transporting sediment from high places to low. They nourished the land they passed through, their banks thick with vegetation, their waters supporting countless forms of life. Fish swam in their currents, navigating upstream to spawn, drifting downstream to feed. Birds gathered along their shores to drink and bathe. Larger animals came to the water's edge at dawn and dusk, their forms reflected in the river's surface. The dragon could sense the health of these rivers, could feel through his connection to all water whether they flowed clear or muddy, whether their levels were adequate or excessive, whether the balance of their ecosystems remained stable. When a river needed rain to maintain its flow, the dragon's awareness noted this, and his breath would shift subtle currents in the celestial realm that would eventually manifest as clouds above that particular watershed. When a river carried too much water, threatening to overflow its banks and flood the surrounding land, the dragon would exhale differently, creating conditions that would slow the rain, allowing the excess water to dissipate harmlessly. Beyond the mountains and rivers, the dragon observed the plains and valleys where humans had built their civilizations. He saw the patchwork of agricultural fields, rectangles, and irregular shapes of cultivated land, each one representing the work of countless hands over countless seasons. The fields changed appearance throughout the year, following cycles that the dragon recognized as expressions of deeper patterns, human activity aligning with cosmic rhythms whether the humans understood this alignment or not. In spring, the fields were prepared, plowed and planted, the dark earth exposed before seeds were sown. The dragon watched farmers walking behind oxen, guiding plows in straight lines, turning the soil, making it ready for new growth. This was hard work, demanding work, but there was a rhythm to it, a meditation in the repetitive motion, a connection to the earth that many who performed this labor felt without being able to name. As summer arrived, the fields filled with growing crops. Rice in the lowland paddies, standing in shallow water that reflected the sky. Wheat and millet in the upland fields, their stalks growing tall, their heads gradually filling with grain. Vegetables in gardens near the houses, tended by hands that knew from long experience when to water, when to weed, when to harvest. The dragon watched this growth with the same patient attention he brought to all things, seeing in it the manifestation of cosmic principles, seed becoming plant, potential becoming actual, the future emerging from the present according to patterns as old as life itself. By autumn, the fields turned golden brown, ready for harvest. The dragon observed the gathering of crops, the cutting and binding and threshing, the storing away of grain that would sustain life through the winter months. This was the culmination of the year's work, the reward for patience and effort, the proof that cooperation with natural cycles brought abundance. The dragon understood this deeply, for his own existence was about cooperation with natural patterns, about working with cosmic rhythms rather than against them. Winter brought stillness to the fields. The earth rested under frost and sometimes snow, dormant but not dead, gathering energy for the next cycle of growth. The dragon recognized this rest as necessary, as essential to the continuing fertility of the land. Nothing could grow continuously without exhaustion. Rest, dormancy, the apparent death of winter, these were not endings but preparations for new beginnings, essential phases in the eternal cycle. Among the fields and along the rivers, villages had grown up over the centuries. The dragon watched these settlements with benevolent curiosity, noting how they changed over the years, how they expanded and sometimes contracted, how they adapted to the landscape and the available resources. The villages were collections of houses, most of them simple structures of wood and clay and stone, with curved roofs that shed rain and snow, with small gardens attached, with paths connecting one dwelling to another. At night, lights appeared in the villages, fires and candles and oil lamps, small points of brightness against the larger darkness. The dragon could sense the warmth of these lights, could feel the human lives gathered around them, families sharing meals, telling stories, preparing for sleep. There was something touching about these small lights, these modest assertions of presence against the vast darkness of the world. They represented consciousness, awareness, the human capacity to create pockets of warmth and safety in an often harsh environment. The dragon did not judge the humans as good or bad, wise or foolish. He simply observed them as he observed everything else, noting their patterns, their rhythms, their ways of being in the world. He saw that they struggled sometimes, that life in the mortal realm brought challenges and difficulties that beings in the celestial realm never faced. But he also saw their resilience, their capacity to endure, their ability to find joy and meaning even in circumstances that seemed to offer little of either. He watched parents caring for children, teaching them the skills they would need to survive and flourish. He observed the elderly, their movements slower than they once were, but their eyes holding knowledge accumulated over decades of experience. He saw young lovers meeting by riverbanks, their futures uncertain but their hope undimmed. He witnessed farmers helping neighbors with harvests, communities coming together in times of need, the bonds between people that made survival possible and life meaningful. The dragon understood that these human lives were brief, that each person he observed would live only a few decades before passing into whatever realm awaited beyond death. This brevity gave human existence an intensity that eternal beings could never know. Every moment mattered because moments were limited. Every relationship carried weight because separation was inevitable. Every joy was precious because joy could not last forever in its particular form. This understanding filled the dragon with something that might be called compassion, though it was not emotion in the way humans experienced emotion. It was more like recognition, acknowledgement, a deep awareness that these brief lives mattered, that their struggles and joys were real and significant despite their temporary nature. The dragon's work maintaining balance, ensuring favorable weather, guiding the gentle rain, all of this was, in a sense, service to these mortal beings who depended on the stability of natural patterns for their survival. Beyond the villages and fields, the dragon's gaze extended to the forests that covered much of the land. These were wild places, unmanaged by human hands, where trees grew according to their own patterns, where animals moved through undergrowth, where streams flowed without the guidance of irrigation channels. The forests were ecosystems of tremendous complexity, thousands of species living in intricate relationships, each one dependent on others, all of them together creating a balanced whole. The dragon appreciated these forests, recognized in them a reflection of cosmic balance operating at a smaller scale. No single species dominated. Resources were shared according to patterns that had evolved over millennia. Death fed life, as fallen trees became homes for insects and fungi, which in turn fed larger creatures, which in turn fertilized the soil with their waste, allowing new trees to grow. The cycle was complete, self-sustaining, requiring no intervention as long as the larger patterns, weather, seasons, the flow of water, remained stable. At the edges of the land, where earth met ocean, the dragon observed the coast with its beaches and tidal zones, its cliffs and rocky shores. The ocean was vast, larger than any continent, its depths holding mysteries that even the dragon could not fully penetrate. But the interaction between ocean and land, the place where water met earth in the eternal dance of waves and tides, this was a region of particular balance, of forces in constant negotiation, of boundaries that were also connections. The dragon watched the tides rise and fall, responding to the pull of moon and sun, ancient rhythms that predated even the dragon's long existence. He saw the way tidal zones hosted unique forms of life, creatures adapted to the constant change between water and air, between submersion and exposure. He observed coastal villages where humans had learned to work with the ocean, fishing in its waters, gathering salt from its edges, building boats to venture out into the vastness. The ocean's surface reflected the sky, creating a mirror that showed the celestial river above. Sometimes, on perfectly calm nights, it seemed as though there were two rivers, one flowing in the heavens, one flowing on the earth, and between them, the dragon maintained his watch, ensuring that both remained in proper balance, that the celestial patterns manifested appropriately in the terrestrial realm. As night fell over the world below, for the dragon's observations often focused on the nighttime world, when darkness made the connection between celestial and terrestrial more apparent, the dragon watched lights appearing throughout the landscape. Fires in villages, lamps in windows, torches carried along paths. These lights were echoes of the stars above, human attempts to push back the darkness, to create islands of visibility in the vast night. The dragon understood the human need for light, for unlike celestial beings who could perceive equally well in darkness and brightness, humans required light to see, to navigate, to feel safe. The lights they created were acts of courage, small rebellions against the night that the dragon found somehow admirable. They represented consciousness asserting itself, awareness refusing to be engulfed by darkness, however temporary that darkness might be. And then, as the night deepened, as the last lights in the villages were extinguished and the world below settled into sleep, the dragon's observation would become more contemplative. He would watch the sleeping world with the same patient attention he brought to all things, seeing in its rest a mirror of his own stillness, recognizing in its quietness a reflection of the peace that was his essential nature. The world below was not perfect. It contained suffering and struggle, discord and difficulty. But it also contained beauty and harmony, moments of grace, instances of perfect balance emerging spontaneously from the complex interactions of countless beings living their lives. And over it all, from his position beneath the celestial river, the dragon maintained his watch, his presence ensuring that the fundamental patterns remained stable, that the cycles continued, that the balance which made all life possible endured through changing seasons and passing ages. The mountains stood. The rivers flowed. The fields produced their harvests. The villages sheltered their people. The forests maintained their ecosystems. The ocean's tides rose and fell. And above it all, the stars traced their paths across the night sky, while below them, hidden in the depths of the celestial river, the dragon watched and breathed and maintained the peace that allowed all of this to continue, season after season, year after year, age after age. The world below the stars, temporary but precious, changing but ordered, full of life that flickered briefly like candle flame before passing into darkness, yet always renewed, always continuing, always finding new forms to express the eternal patterns that the dragon, in his infinite patience, helped to maintain. A season of perfect balance. There came a time, though time is perhaps the wrong word for a period that existed more as a quality than as a duration, when the balance between heaven and earth achieved a perfection that was rare even by the dragon's long experience. It was not that balance had been absent before, for the dragon's constant presence ensured that fundamental harmony was always maintained. But this was something more, something special, a moment, or perhaps a season, or perhaps even longer, when every element aligned with every other element in such complete accord that the distinction between maintaining balance and simply existing within it disappeared entirely. The dragon recognized this perfection immediately, not through any dramatic sign or sudden revelation, but through the quality of the celestial currents around him. They flowed with an ease that required no adjustment, no subtle guidance, no gentle correction. The waters of the celestial river moved in patterns so harmonious that they seemed almost to sing, though the song was silence, the melody was stillness, and the rhythm was the absence of any disruption to disturb the fundamental peace. In this time of perfect balance, the dragon's already minimal movements became even less noticeable. His body, coiled through the depths, seemed to merge with the currents themselves, becoming indistinguishable from the flow. His jade scales reflected light in patterns that matched the rhythms of celestial water so precisely that he appeared to be made of the same substance, a formation of living jade suspended in liquid jade, distinction dissolved in perfect unity. His breath, already slow beyond mortal comprehension, slowed further still. The intervals between inhalation and exhalation lengthened, each breath spanning what might have been days in the world below, each pause between breaths holding a stillness so complete that it approached the eternal. Yet even in this profound stillness, the dragon remained aware, remained present, his consciousness spread throughout the celestial river, his attention encompassing everything without strain or effort. In the world below, the effects of this perfect balance manifested in ways both subtle and profound. The seasons turned with a smoothness that went beyond the usual progression of one phase into the next. Spring did not simply follow winter, it emerged from winter so gradually, so naturally, that it seemed winter had always contained spring within it, waiting only for the right moment to reveal itself. The last snows melted into water that the earth received gratefully, without flood or erosion. The first green shoots appeared exactly when they should, neither too early to risk late frost nor too late to miss the optimal growing conditions. As spring unfolded, the rains came with perfect timing. Not too much, not too little, but precisely the amount needed for seeds to germinate, for roots to establish, for the new growth to flourish. The rain fell gently, in soft showers that lasted the right duration, followed by periods of clear sky that allowed the sun to warm the earth without scorching it. Farmers working in their fields noticed this, though they might not have been able to articulate exactly what made this spring different from others. They simply found that their work went smoothly, that the earth responded to their efforts with unusual generosity, that everything seemed to happen at exactly the right time. The rivers ran clear and full, their levels maintained by snowmelt from the mountains and rain from the clouds that the dragon's breath had helped to form. Fish thrived in these waters, their populations healthy and abundant. The water was neither too warm nor too cold, neither too swift nor too sluggish, but perfectly suited to support the complex ecosystems that depended on it. Along the riverbanks, vegetation grew lush and thick, providing habitat for countless creatures, creating corridors of life that connected mountains to plains, forests to fields. Summer arrived with the same grace that had characterized spring's emergence. The heat came gradually, building day by day until it reached its peak, but even at its warmest, the temperature remained tolerable. Crops grew tall and strong, their roots drawing water from soil that remained moist despite the sun's intensity. The dragon's influence ensured that clouds formed when shade was needed, that breezes stirred when the air grew too still, that the balance between sun and rain maintained itself without dramatic swings toward drought or deluge. In the villages and towns, people went about their lives with a sense of ease that was unusual even in times of general prosperity. There were still challenges, still difficulties, for mortal existence always contained struggle, but the underlying conditions of life were favorable in a way that reduced hardship to manageable levels. Food was plentiful because the crops grew well. Water was abundant because the wells remained full and the rivers flowed strong. Illness was less common than usual because the balance of heat and cool, wet and dry, maintained itself in ranges that supported health rather than undermining it. The dragon, from his position beneath the celestial river, observed these effects with a satisfaction that was not pride, for pride implies ego, and the dragon had transcended such things, but rather a deep contentment that came from witnessing purpose fulfilled. This was what his existence was for, to maintain the conditions that allowed life to flourish, to ensure that the patterns remained stable enough that beings both mortal and divine could pursue their own purposes without the disruption of fundamental imbalance. In this time of perfect balance, the dragon's work became almost invisible, even to himself. There was nothing to adjust, nothing to correct, nothing requiring intervention. The cosmic order maintained itself, each element supporting every other element in a self-sustaining harmony. The dragon could simply be, his presence alone sufficient to anchor the balance, his awareness alone enough to ensure that any deviation from perfection would be immediately perceived and, if necessary, gently addressed. But no such addressing was needed. Day followed night, night followed day, and the progression was smooth as the flow of water over polished stone. The moon waxed and waned in its reliable rhythm, its pull on the oceans creating tides that rose and fell with metronomic precision. The stars traced their paths across the night sky, each one following the course it had followed for eons, each one contributing its light to the greater pattern of the celestial river. As summer gave way to autumn, the transition was once again flawless. The heat diminished gradually, replaced by the crisp coolness that made physical labor less exhausting, that allowed the ripening crops to complete their maturation without stress. The leaves on the trees began their transformation, shifting from green to yellow to red to gold, not all at once but in waves of color that rippled through the forests like slow fire, beautiful and unhurried. The harvest came at exactly the right time. The grain had filled completely, the fruit had reached peak sweetness, the vegetables had achieved their full size. Farmers gathering these crops found their work easier than usual, not because they worked less hard but because everything cooperated. The weather remained dry during harvest, allowing cut grain to be gathered without damage from rain. The air was cool enough that the work didn't exhaust the workers, but warm enough that frozen fingers didn't fumble with their tasks. Storage areas filled with the abundance of a successful season. Granaries held wheat and rice and millet, enough to feed families through the winter with surplus to trade. Cellars held vegetables that would last for months. Dried fruits hung from rafters. Preserved meats rested in salt. The material conditions for survival through the cold season had been secured, and the securing had required the usual hard work but had been accomplished without the additional burden of unfavorable conditions. The dragon watched all of this, his jade-scaled body barely moving, his breath stirring the celestial waters with exhalations so gentle they could hardly be called movement. His eyes remained half-closed, his perception turned inward and outward simultaneously, observing the manifestation of balance in the world below while maintaining awareness of the cosmic patterns that ensured such balance could continue. In this state of perfect harmony, the boundary between the dragon and the celestial river became indistinct. He was the river, in a sense, or the river was him, or perhaps both statements were true simultaneously. His essence flowed through the celestial currents just as those currents flowed through regions that might be considered his body. The distinction between container and contained, between being and environment, dissolved in the perfection of alignment. This was the dragon's natural state, the condition he existed to embody and to protect. Not the dramatic peace that comes after conflict resolution, not the tentative calm that emerges from careful negotiation between opposing forces, but the fundamental peace that underlies all existence, the ground state of reality itself when nothing disturbs it, when all elements rest in their proper relationships, when the cosmic order expresses itself without impediment. Winter arrived as gently as the previous seasons had turned. The cold came gradually, giving trees time to enter their dormancy fully, giving animals time to prepare their shelters and food stores, giving humans time to secure their houses and gather fuel for heating. The first snow fell softly, covering the earth with a blanket that insulated the sleeping plants beneath, that reflected moonlight and made the night world luminous and peaceful. Throughout the winter, the temperature remained cold enough to maintain the snow cover, to keep the earth in its necessary rest, but not so cold that suffering became widespread. Storms were rare, and when they came, they were not the violent blizzards that could trap travelers and threaten livestock, but manageable snowfalls that added to the white landscape without creating dangerous conditions. Inside their houses, families gathered around fires that burned steadily, fueled by wood that had been properly dried during the autumn. The warmth was sufficient, the food stores adequate, the sense of security well-founded. People told stories, performed quiet work, mending tools, weaving cloth, carving implements needed for the coming spring. Children played in the snow during daylight hours, their laughter carrying through the cold air, their energy undimmed by the season's restrictions. The dragon, in his realm beneath the celestial river, maintained his vigil through the winter as he had through all the other seasons. His stillness was complete, his peace absolute, his presence the anchor that kept the balance stable even as the world below cycled through its coldest, darkest phase. He knew that this winter, like the seasons that had preceded it, was unfolding exactly as it should, that the cold and darkness were necessary parts of the greater cycle, that spring would come again because winter was doing its work properly. And in this time of perfect balance, the dragon understood, though understanding is perhaps too active a word for what was more like deep recognition, that these periods were gifts, temporary expressions of the potential that always existed within the cosmic order but which rarely manifested with such completeness. The balance he maintained was constant, but its perfection varied. Usually, there were minor fluctuations, small deviations from ideal that required his gentle correction. But now, in this special time, no correction was needed. Everything flowed as it should, and his role was simply to be present, to embody the peace that allowed this perfection to continue. How long this time lasted, measured by any external standard, the dragon could not have said and did not think to question. In his experience of it, the time was eternal, not in the sense of lasting forever, but in the sense of existing outside normal temporal flow, each moment complete in itself, each day containing all days, each season encompassing all seasons. The perfection was not a destination to be reached or a goal to be achieved, but a state to be inhabited, and the inhabiting of it was the reward itself. But even perfection must eventually yield to change, for change is itself part of balance, part of the pattern that governs all existence. The dragon knew this, had always known it, would always know it. This time of flawless harmony was precious precisely because it was temporary, because it represented a peak that would eventually yield to the more typical condition of good enough balance, of harmony maintained through constant small adjustments rather than effortless alignment. Yet even knowing this, even holding awareness that the time would end, the dragon remained utterly present within it. He did not anticipate its ending, did not prepare for the inevitable shift back to normal conditions. He simply existed within the perfection, allowing it to be what it was, complete and sufficient and requiring nothing beyond itself. The celestial river flowed smoothly above him, around him, through him. The world below cycled through its seasons in flawless progression. The cosmic patterns maintained themselves in perfect accord. And the dragon, vast and ancient and fundamentally peaceful, coiled in the hidden depths, breathing slowly, watching calmly, embodying the balance that made all of this possible. Stillness. Harmony. Peace. Perfect, complete, and, for now, endless. A subtle disturbance in the heavens. The change, when it came, was so slight that at first it might not have been called a change at all. It was more like a whisper in a silent room, more like a single note played slightly off-key in an otherwise perfect harmony, more like a barely perceptible shift in the quality of light that one might notice only after looking away and then looking back again. But to the dragon, whose awareness encompassed the entirety of the celestial river and whose perception was tuned to detect the most minute deviations from balance, even this whisper-thin alteration registered immediately. It began in one of the distant reaches of the river, far from where the dragon's body currently rested, in a region where the stars clustered densely and the celestial currents normally flowed with particular smoothness. There, something had shifted. Not broken, not reversed, not violently disrupted, simply shifted, as if the pattern had moved slightly off its usual course, as if the rhythm had hesitated for a fraction of a moment before continuing. The dragon perceived this through the network of his awareness, feeling it as one might feel a distant pebble dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading outward, growing fainter but never quite disappearing. The sensation was not painful. The dragon did not experience pain as mortals did, but it was present, noticeable, a small asymmetry in the otherwise perfect symmetry of cosmic flow. His eyes, which had remained half-closed in contentment throughout the time of perfect balance, opened slightly wider. The moonlight color of his irises brightened, their glow illuminating the immediate waters around him as his attention focused more sharply on the source of the disturbance. He did not move his body, not yet, for movement without full understanding would itself constitute disruption. Instead, he extended his perception further, reaching through the celestial currents to examine the anomaly more closely. What he found was subtle almost beyond description. A slight turbulence in the flow, a minor eddy where the currents should have been smooth, a small region where the celestial water seemed to be moving in a pattern that didn't quite match the surrounding patterns. It was as if a thread had been pulled slightly loose in an otherwise perfect tapestry, not enough to create a hole, not enough to unravel the whole, but enough to create a small pucker, a minor distortion that affected the threads around it. The dragon considered this development with the calm that came from eons of experience. Disturbances occurred. They were part of the nature of existence, of systems complex enough to allow for variation, of patterns intricate enough to occasionally generate minor deviations. What mattered was not that such disturbances never occurred, that would be impossible, but that they were recognized early and addressed before they could propagate into larger disruptions. He traced the disturbance to its probable source. Somewhere in the celestial realm, though not in the celestial river itself, some configuration had shifted. Perhaps a minor deity had altered their usual routine. Perhaps a celestial structure had settled slightly under the weight of ages. Perhaps some energy flow that normally passed through the river without effect had changed its trajectory minutely. The specific cause mattered less than the effect, and the effect, while noticeable, was not yet significant. But the dragon understood patterns. He understood how small deviations could amplify, how minor turbulence could breed larger turbulence, how asymmetry could propagate through a system until balance was lost. He had seen it happen before, in the distant past, during times when his vigilance had been less complete or when disturbances had emerged so quickly that even his rapid response had not been rapid enough to prevent consequences. He watched the turbulent region carefully, his perception focused on it while simultaneously maintaining awareness of the river as a whole. For a time, measured in what would be hours or perhaps days in the mortal world, the disturbance remained stable, neither growing nor diminishing, simply persisting as a small imperfection in an otherwise harmonious system. The dragon considered whether intervention was necessary or whether the system's natural resilience might resolve the issue without his active participation. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the turbulence began to spread. The eddy grew slightly larger. The asymmetry in the flow became marginally more pronounced. Currents that had been moving smoothly began to show minor variations in their velocity. It was still subtle, still far from critical, but the direction of change was clear. The disturbance was not self-correcting. Left unaddressed, it would continue to grow, slowly but inexorably, until it affected larger regions of the river, until its influence reached into the world below, until balance gave way to imbalance. The dragon understood what was required. This was the moment for which he existed, the purpose that defined his being. The time of perfect balance, that precious period when his presence alone had been sufficient, had ended. Now his work would need to become more active, more intentional. He would need to move, to intervene, to apply his understanding of cosmic patterns toward the restoration of harmony. But even this understanding brought no urgency, no anxiety, no sense of crisis. The dragon did not experience such emotions. There was simply recognition of what needed to be done, acceptance of the necessity, and preparation to do what his nature and purpose required. The disturbance was a problem, yes, but problems were natural. They arose, they were addressed, and balance was restored. This was the cycle, the pattern, the way of things. In the world below, the effects of the disturbance were not yet apparent. The seasons continued their progression, the weather remained generally favorable, life proceeded as it had during the time of perfect balance. But the dragon's perception, far more sensitive than mortal awareness could be, detected the earliest hints of change. A slight shift in wind patterns over a particular mountain range. A minor variation in the temperature of certain ocean currents. A barely noticeable change in the timing of tides in some distant coastal region. These changes were tiny, insignificant by themselves, unlikely to be noticed by even the most careful observers in the mortal realm. A farmer might notice that the wind seemed slightly different but would attribute it to normal variation. A fisherman might perceive that the tides were not quite as predictable as usual but would adjust his schedule accordingly. No one would see these small changes as connected, as symptoms of a larger pattern, as the first manifestations of celestial disturbance. But the dragon saw the connections. He understood how the turbulence in the celestial river's distant reaches could influence atmospheric patterns, how shifts in celestial current could affect terrestrial weather, how imbalance in heaven could manifest as disharmony on earth. The effects were still minimal, still well within the range of normal variation, but they were present, and they would grow if the underlying cause was not addressed. The stars in the affected region showed the disturbance most clearly. To mortal eyes, they would appear unchanged, still bright, still fixed in their constellations, still tracing their usual paths across the night sky. But to the dragon's perception, they flickered slightly, their light carrying subtle irregularities, their positions showing minute oscillations that deviated from their ideal courses. The celestial river in that region appeared dimmer, its luminosity reduced by a fraction that would be imperceptible to any but the most sensitive observation. The dragon extended tendrils of his awareness through the disturbed region, examining it from multiple perspectives, understanding its geometry, its dynamics, its relationship to the larger patterns of the river. He noted how the turbulence created feedback loops, how the distorted flow affected the flow around it, how the asymmetry propagated through mechanisms that were simple in principle but complex in their specific manifestations. And he began to formulate his response. Not a violent correction, not a forceful suppression of the disturbance, but a gentle realignment, a subtle adjustment that would allow the natural harmony to reassert itself. The dragon understood that the most effective interventions were often the least obvious, that working with existing patterns rather than against them produced the most stable results, that patience and precision mattered more than power or speed. The time for stillness had passed. The time for action, gentle, measured, carefully considered action, had arrived. The dragon, who had been coiled in the depths in motionless contentment, began to prepare for movement. His muscles, which had been relaxed into near-perfect stillness, began to tense slightly, gathering the energy needed for the journey to the disturbed region. His breathing, already slow, became more deliberate, each inhalation drawing in not just celestial water but intention, each exhalation releasing not just mist but preparation. His jade scales began to shimmer with increased luminosity, as if his body were drawing in light, storing it for the work ahead. The flowing strands of his mane moved with greater complexity, responding to currents that came from within as much as from without. His eyes opened fully for the first time in what might have been years or decades, their moonlight color blazing with gentle intensity, illuminating the waters around him with radiance that pushed back the darkness, that revealed depths that had been hidden. The dragon did not rush. Even preparing to address a disturbance, even recognizing the need for intervention, his movements remained measured, deliberate, unhurried. There was no benefit in haste, no advantage in moving before full preparation was complete. The disturbance would wait. It was not growing rapidly, not threatening imminent catastrophe. There was time to do this properly, to ensure that his response would be effective and proportionate, that his intervention would restore balance without creating new imbalances through excessive force. Around him, the celestial currents responded to his changing state. Where his body had been nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding flow, it now became more distinct, more present, more defined. The boundary between dragon and river reasserted itself, not as separation but as differentiation, as the distinction between the tool and the task, between the being who would act and the medium through which action would occur. Other currents began to shift in response to his movement. Not dramatically, not violently, but with the inevitability of natural adjustment. Water flowing around an obstacle finds new paths. Patterns accommodating a change ripple outward through the system. The dragon's preparation to move created its own subtle effects, its own minor redistributions of energy and momentum, all of which had to be accounted for, all of which had to be integrated into his plan for addressing the disturbance. The dragon took his time with these preparations. There was a right moment for action, a point when all factors aligned, when the conditions were optimal for intervention. Moving too soon would be inefficient. Moving too late would allow the disturbance to grow unnecessarily. The dragon, with his vast experience and his deep understanding of cosmic patterns, knew how to identify that right moment, how to recognize when preparation was complete and action should begin. As he prepared, he maintained his vigilant observation of the disturbed region. The turbulence continued its slow growth, but the rate remained steady, predictable, manageable. There were no sudden changes, no unexpected accelerations, no signs that the situation was deteriorating faster than anticipated. This confirmed the dragon's assessment that gentle intervention would be sufficient, that forceful action was neither necessary nor desirable. The world below continued its cycles, unaware of the subtle drama unfolding in the celestial realm above. Day followed night, weather patterns shifted gradually, life proceeded in its ordinary complexity. The humans and animals and plants going about their business had no idea that the harmony sustaining them was experiencing minor strain, that the balance they depended on required active maintenance, that the dragon who watched over them was preparing to leave his long stillness to ensure that the cosmic order remained intact. This ignorance was as it should be. The dragon did not require recognition or gratitude. His work was its own purpose, its own reward. If the mortals below remained unaware of his efforts, if they experienced the continued stability of seasons and weather as simply the natural order of things, then his work was successful. The best maintenance was invisible maintenance, the most effective protection was protection that went unnoticed. The dragon's eyes blazed brighter. His body coiled more tightly, gathering itself. His breath grew deeper, each inhalation longer, each exhalation more controlled. The moment approached. Soon, very soon, he would move. He would leave the region where he had rested for so long. He would travel through the celestial currents to the distant reach where the disturbance waited. He would address the imbalance, restore the harmony, ensure that the celestial river continued to flow as it should. But not yet. Not quite yet. A little more preparation. A little more gathering of energy. A little more precise calculation of angles and timing and the specific adjustments that would be required. The dragon waited, coiled and ready, his vast body preparing to move for the first time in ages, his ancient wisdom guiding his preparation, his fundamental nature ensuring that when he moved, the movement would be exactly what was needed, no more, no less, perfectly calibrated to restore the balance that was his eternal purpose to maintain. The disturbance flickered in the distance, a small imperfection in the cosmic order, waiting to be addressed, waiting for the dragon to bring his gentle force to bear upon it, waiting for harmony to be restored. Soon. The dragon's gentle descent. The moment arrived without announcement, without any external signal that conditions had changed. But the dragon knew. In the same way that water knows when to flow downhill, in the same way that night knows when to yield to dawn, the dragon knew that the time had come to move. His preparation was complete. The celestial currents had aligned themselves favorably. The disturbance waited at its precise location. Everything was ready. The dragon began to move. The movement was so gradual that at first it appeared to be no movement at all, merely a subtle shift in the play of light across jade scales, a minor redistribution of luminosity in the surrounding darkness. But it was movement, genuine and purposeful, the first significant displacement of the dragon's vast body in an age of stillness. He uncoiled slowly, his serpentine form extending through the celestial depths with the patience of geological time. Each segment of his body moved slightly before the next, creating a wave that traveled along his length, a ripple that propagated from head to tail over what would have been hours in mortal reckoning. His muscles, which had been relaxed in rest, engaged smoothly, powerfully, with the controlled strength of forces long held in reserve and now carefully released. As he moved, the celestial currents around him shifted. The water that had flowed past his motionless form now had to accommodate a body in motion, had to adjust its paths, had to find new routes around this vast obstacle that was no longer stationary. The adjustments were smooth, natural, as if the river itself had been waiting for this movement, as if the currents welcomed the change rather than resisting it. The dragon's movement created patterns in the celestial water, swirls and eddies that formed in his wake, currents that spiraled outward from his passage, disturbances that were themselves expressions of balance, of energy redistributed according to natural law. These patterns were beautiful, if there had been eyes to see them, geometric forms that unfolded in 3 dimensions, in 4 dimensions, in dimensions that mortal mathematics had no notation to describe. His tail, that long extension that had been coiled in complex knots during his rest, began to unfurl. The process was slow, deliberate, each loop releasing gradually, the vast length extending behind him as he moved forward through the depths. The fin-like structure at the tail's tip traced patterns in the celestial water, patterns that would eventually manifest in the world below as wind currents, as the gentle movements of air that stirred the surface of lakes, that rustled through forests, that carried seeds from one place to another. The dragon's mane flowed backward with his movement, the strands streaming behind him like banners in a current, like ribbons of liquid light marking his passage through the darkness. The colors that shifted through the mane intensified with his motion, responding to the increased flow of energy through his body, creating displays of subtle radiance that pulsed and flowed in rhythms that matched his breathing, his heartbeat, the fundamental oscillations of his being. His eyes, now fully open and blazing with moonlight intensity, illuminated the path ahead. The light they cast revealed regions of the celestial river that had been hidden in darkness, showing depths and structures that existed only in the spaces between visible reality. The dragon navigated by this light, by the perception it enabled, seeing not just where he was going but understanding the currents that would carry him there, the forces that would aid or hinder his passage, the optimal path through the complex geometry of celestial space. As the dragon moved through the depths of the celestial river, he began a gradual descent. Not downward in any simple sense, direction worked differently in the realm between heaven and earth, but movement toward the world below, toward the boundary where celestial influence manifested most directly in terrestrial effects. His journey toward the disturbance required this descent, this approach to the liminal zone where heaven and earth came closest to touching. The descent was like passing through veils, through layers of existence that separated one mode of being from another. The dragon moved through regions where the celestial water became less abstract, more substantial, where the currents began to take on qualities that approximated physical properties as mortals understood them. Temperature became more meaningful here, and pressure, and the resistance that water could offer to bodies moving through it. As he descended, the dragon passed through the realm of high clouds, those formations that existed at the upper reaches of the atmosphere, in the cold thin air where ice crystals formed and the boundary between sky and space grew ambiguous. These clouds responded to his passage, swirling in patterns that reflected the turbulence of his movement, gathering into formations that would later drift apart or coalesce into weather systems, their ultimate configuration influenced by the dragon's passage but not directly controlled by it. His body, vast as it was, moved through these cloud layers like a needle through silk, parting them gently, leaving trails in his wake that would gradually fade but which, while they lasted, created pathways of clear air, corridors through which light could pass more freely, channels that wind could follow with less resistance. Birds flying at these altitudes, rare creatures adapted to thin air and extreme cold, might sense his passage as a change in air pressure, as an inexplicable clearing of mist, as a moment of unusual warmth in otherwise frigid conditions. Lower still, the dragon descended through regions where the clouds were thicker, where water vapor had condensed into droplets that hung suspended in the air, creating the billowing masses that mortals saw from below as cumulus and stratus, as the great pillars and blankets that decorated the sky. These clouds were more substantial than their higher counterparts, more influenced by the dragon's physical presence, and they swirled and reformed around him as he passed, their shapes influenced by the currents his movement created. The dragon's breath, as he descended, mixed with these cloud layers, his exhalations adding moisture and energy, his inhalations drawing in air that carried information about conditions in the world below. He could taste the air, could sense through it the state of the land beneath the clouds, could determine where rain was needed and where the ground was already saturated, where crops grew thick and where fields lay fallow, where rivers ran full and where stream beds had dried to dust. This information integrated automatically into his understanding of the situation, into his evolving plan for addressing the celestial disturbance. For the dragon knew that his work was not separate from the needs of the world below, that restoring balance in heaven meant ensuring appropriate conditions on earth, that the two realms were interconnected in ways that required any intervention to consider both simultaneously. As he moved through the clouds, rain began to fall in certain regions below. Not because the dragon willed it specifically, but because his passage had the natural effect of disturbing the equilibrium of suspended water droplets, causing them to coalesce and grow heavy enough to fall. The rain was gentle, a soft shower that would nourish rather than flood, that would soak into the earth rather than running off, that would fill wells and streams without overwhelming them. Farmers working in fields below might look up at the sky in surprise, seeing clouds gathering where moments before there had been clear air, feeling the first drops of rain on their faces and wondering at its sudden arrival. but they would welcome it if their fields needed water, would accept it as the natural order of things, would not suspect that a celestial dragon had passed overhead, that his movement through the clouds had triggered the rain that now blessed their crops. The dragon continued his descent, moving now through the lower atmosphere, through the realm where weather truly lived, where the interaction between warm air and cold air created the dynamic systems that determined whether mortals experienced sunshine or storm, calm or tempest, gentle rain or driving downpour. This was a complex realm, full of competing forces, of unstable equilibria that could shift rapidly, of patterns that emerged and dissolved with bewildering speed. But the dragon understood these patterns, had observed them for eons, knew their rhythms as intimately as he knew the currents of the celestial river itself. He moved through the atmospheric chaos with perfect calm, his presence acting as a stabilizing influence, his passage smoothing out the most extreme gradients, his breath moderating the harshest transitions between air masses. Where two fronts met with violence potential, the dragon's tail would sweep between them, its movement creating a buffer zone where the opposition could resolve more gradually. Where updrafts threatened to develop into thunderstorms, his breath would cool and calm the rising air, allowing it to disperse harmlessly rather than building into systems capable of producing lightning and hail. Where winds had begun to rotate in patterns that might spawn tornadoes, his body's passage would disrupt the rotation, scattering the energy that had been concentrating dangerously. All of this happened naturally, as side effects of his movement rather than as deliberate interventions. The dragon was traveling to address the celestial disturbance, not to manage terrestrial weather. But his very passage through the atmospheric layers had these beneficial effects, this calming influence, this tendency to smooth out the extremes and restore conditions toward balanced means. Lower still, approaching the surface now, the dragon moved through the layer where rain formed and fell, where fog gathered in valleys, where morning mist rose from rivers and lakes. His jade scales caught the light filtering through clouds, reflecting it in ways that created optical phenomena, unusual glows in the mist, strange colorations in the fog, momentary rainbows that appeared and vanished without visible sun or rain to explain them. Those few mortals who happened to be watching the sky at the right moment, in the right location, might catch a glimpse of something they could not quite explain. A shimmer in the clouds that seemed almost like movement. A glow that appeared jade green for an instant before fading. A sense of vast presence passing overhead, felt more than seen, registered by some deep instinct that existed before language, before rational thought. But these glimpses were rare and ambiguous, easily dismissed as tricks of light, as imagination, as the result of staring too long at clouds that naturally created suggestive shapes. The dragon's passage remained essentially hidden, his intervention in the mortal realm subtle enough that it went unrecognized, that it affected conditions without revealing its agency. The dragon could sense the earth now, could perceive its solid presence below him, could feel the way it anchored the atmospheric systems above it, providing the stable foundation against which air and water and cloud could move. He sensed the mountains rising up toward him, their peaks sometimes disappearing into the cloud layer, their slopes channeling winds and gathering rain. He sensed the rivers and lakes, their surfaces reflecting whatever sky revealed itself through breaks in the clouds, their depths holding water that had once been rain, that would someday be rain again, that participated in the eternal cycle of evaporation and condensation that connected earth to sky. His awareness touched the lives unfolding on the surface, the humans and animals and plants all going about their existence, all dependent on the stability of seasons and weather, all trusting in a cosmic order they could not see but which the dragon's work helped maintain. He felt no superiority toward these mortal beings, no sense of being above them in any fundamental way. They were simply different, existing in a different mode, experiencing a different relationship to time and space and change. But their lives mattered, their flourishing depended on his work, and this gave his current journey additional significance beyond the mere restoration of celestial harmony. The dragon's movement through the lower atmosphere created currents that would persist for days after his passage, that would influence weather patterns across vast regions, that would bring rain to some areas and clear skies to others, all in accordance with what balance required. His presence acted like a gentle hand stirring a bowl of water, creating flows that would eventually settle into new stable configurations, patterns that would support life and growth and the continuation of natural cycles. Rivers below responded to his passage, their surfaces rippling without visible wind to cause the movement, their flows adjusting slightly as if guided by invisible hands. Fish in those rivers felt the change as a subtle shift in currents, as an alteration in water pressure that they could sense through their lateral lines, as a presence that was not threatening but which registered nonetheless, that caused them to adjust their swimming patterns slightly, that influenced their movements in ways they could not have articulated even if they had possessed language to do so. Lakes took on unusual aspects as the dragon passed over them, their surfaces showing patterns of light and shadow that had no obvious source, their waters seeming to glow from within for brief moments before returning to ordinary appearance. Morning mist rising from these lakes took on unusual thickness, unusual patterns, creating displays that were beautiful even if their cause remained mysterious. And gradually, by degrees so subtle that no single moment showed dramatic change, the dragon completed his descent. He had moved from the hidden depths of the celestial river, through the boundary between celestial and terrestrial, through the layers of atmosphere and cloud, approaching ever closer to the world below. He had not touched the earth itself, his destination was the disturbance in the celestial realm, not the mortal world, but he had descended far enough that his presence influenced terrestrial conditions directly, that his movements had immediate and visible effects on weather and water and the patterns of life that depended on both. Now, positioned at the optimal altitude, at the precise level where celestial influence and terrestrial manifestation intersected most effectively, the dragon began to move horizontally, traveling through the atmosphere toward the distant region where the disturbance waited. His descent complete, the next phase of his journey could begin. Behind him, the path of his passage remained visible for a time, as unusual cloud formations, as unexpected rain showers, as moments of unusual calm in otherwise turbulent weather. But these traces faded gradually, the atmosphere returning to its normal patterns, the systems he had influenced finding new equilibria. The dragon moved forward, unhurried and inevitable, his vast body flowing through the air like water through water, his presence bringing calm, his passage restoring balance, his journey continuing toward the resolution that would heal the disturbance and allow the cosmic order to resume its proper configuration. Gentle, powerful, unstoppable. Restoring the celestial flow. The dragon approached the region of disturbance with the same unhurried grace that had characterized his entire journey. As he drew nearer, his perception of the anomaly grew more detailed, more precise. What had been a distant sense of asymmetry became a clear understanding of the specific ways in which the celestial currents had deviated from their proper configuration, the exact angles at which the flow had been disrupted, the precise degree to which balance had been compromised. The disturbance manifested as a kind of knot in the celestial fabric, a place where currents that should have flowed smoothly had become tangled, where energy that should have circulated freely had become caught in loops that fed back upon themselves. It was not chaotic exactly, the fundamental laws of cosmic order still operated, but it was inefficient, wasteful, a configuration that consumed more energy than it should to maintain patterns that were less optimal than they could be. The dragon circled the disturbed region, moving around it rather than through it, observing it from multiple angles, understanding it from different perspectives. His vast body traced a spiral path through the celestial currents, each loop bringing him slightly closer to the center of the disturbance while simultaneously gathering information about its boundaries, its internal structure, its relationship to the surrounding flows. As he circled, his presence began to influence the disturbance even before he actively intervened. The turbulent currents, encountering the calm solidity of his jade-scaled body, began to slow slightly. The feedback loops, meeting the resistance of his mass, started to dissipate their excess energy. The knot, feeling the gravitational influence of his proximity, began very gradually to loosen, like a tangle of thread responding to gentle tugging at its edges. The dragon observed these preliminary effects with satisfaction. They confirmed his assessment that forceful intervention would be unnecessary, that his mere presence, properly positioned and patiently maintained, would provide most of what was needed to restore proper flow. This was always the preferred approach, to work with natural tendencies toward balance rather than imposing balance through overwhelming force. His circling brought him closer to the heart of the disturbance, his spiral tightening, his path becoming more focused. With each rotation, he adjusted his position minutely, aligning himself more precisely with the currents, finding the angles that would allow his body to serve as both barrier and channel, both obstacle and pathway, guiding the flows back toward their optimal configurations through nothing more than his strategic placement in the cosmic geometry. The dragon's breath played a crucial role in this work. As he circled, he inhaled deeply, drawing in the turbulent currents, pulling them into his body where they could be processed, filtered, their excess energy absorbed and their chaotic motion calmed. The celestial water entered through his nostrils, traveled through the complex passages within his form, passages that existed in multiple dimensions, that connected regions of space that appeared separate but which, in the dragon's body, were intimately joined, and emerged from his mouth as smooth, laminar flow, perfectly ordered, ideally configured. Each breath cycle moved vast quantities of celestial water through this internal processing. Each exhalation added calm currents back into the disturbed region, gradually diluting the turbulence with properly flowing streams. It was like pouring smooth water into choppy water, the calm gradually pervading the chaos, the ordered motion overwhelming the disorder through sheer volume and persistence. But the dragon's work required more than just breathing. He needed to address the fundamental cause of the disturbance, the underlying asymmetry that had allowed the turbulence to form in the first place. His circling had revealed this cause, a slight misalignment in one of the celestial structures that bordered this region of the river, a minor displacement that had altered the boundary conditions. That had changed the way currents entering the region were directed, that had created the initial conditions from which turbulence had grown. The dragon could not directly adjust the celestial structure, that would require powers he did not possess, interventions in realms beyond his jurisdiction. But he could compensate for the misalignment through his positioning, through using his body as a replacement boundary, a living structure that redirected the incoming currents as they should have been redirected, that provided the guidance the misaligned structure no longer offered. He positioned himself carefully, his long serpentine body stretching across the region where the disturbance was strongest, his form creating a gentle curve that matched the ideal flow pattern, that encouraged currents to follow the path they would have followed if the underlying structure had remained properly aligned. His scales, oriented at precise angles, caught the flowing currents and deflected them smoothly, each scale acting as a tiny rudder, a minute adjustment mechanism that contributed to the larger work of redirecting the flow. The dragon's tail, that long extension with its fin-like terminus, proved particularly useful in this work. He positioned the tail across the outflow region of the disturbance, where the tangled currents were attempting to re-enter the main flow of the celestial river. The tail acted as a comb, as a series of barriers that broke up the largest eddies, that separated the turbulent streams into smaller flows that could be more easily reintegrated into the surrounding currents. The fin at the tail's end moved with subtle precision, adjusting its angle constantly, responding to variations in the outflow, ensuring that no single stream carried too much momentum, that the reintegration happened gradually rather than abruptly, that the transition from disturbed to calm occurred over a sufficient distance that shock waves could not form, that instabilities could not propagate back into regions already calmed. As the dragon worked, maintaining his position, breathing the turbulent water through his body, using his form to reshape the flows, the disturbance began to resolve. Not quickly, the process took time measured in what would be days or weeks in the mortal world, but steadily, reliably, with the inevitability of water finding its level, of energy seeking equilibrium, of natural systems returning to their optimal states when given appropriate guidance. The knot in the celestial fabric loosened further. The feedback loops broke apart, their energy dissipating into the surrounding flows rather than reinforcing the turbulence. The tangled currents straightened, aligning themselves with the paths the dragon's positioning encouraged them to follow. The efficiency of the flow improved, the waste decreased, the balance gradually reasserted itself. Throughout this work, the dragon maintained his awareness of the effects manifesting in the world below. As the celestial disturbance resolved, the minor weather anomalies that had begun to appear on Earth also corrected themselves. Wind patterns that had started to deviate from their seasonal norms returned to expected configurations. Ocean currents that had shown unusual variations resumed their typical flows. Temperature gradients that had been slightly off reassumed their proper values. In the regions directly beneath the disturbance, the effects of the dragon's work were most noticeable, though still subtle enough that most mortals would not recognize them as anything unusual. Rain that had been forecast failed to arrive, because the atmospheric instability that would have produced it had been calmed at its celestial source. Winds that had been building toward storm force gradually died down, their energy dissipated by the restoration of balance in the currents above. Crops that had been stressed by unfavorable conditions found those conditions moderating, allowing them to recover and resume healthy growth. The dragon observed these terrestrial effects with quiet satisfaction. This was the ultimate purpose of his work, not to maintain celestial harmony for its own sake, though that mattered, but to ensure that the cosmic order supported life in the world below, that the patterns mortals depended on remained stable, that the foundation upon which they built their civilization stayed solid and reliable. As the days passed, measured by the world below, for in the dragon's timeless work, day and night held no meaning, the disturbance continued to diminish. The turbulent region grew smaller as more and more of the flow returned to proper configuration. The energy that had been trapped in unproductive loops found productive pathways. The asymmetry that had initiated the problem corrected itself as the compensating presence of the dragon's body provided the boundary conditions needed for stable flow. The stars in the affected region, which had shown subtle flickering to the dragon's sensitive perception, steadied in their light. Their positions, which had oscillated minutely around their ideal coordinates, stabilized. The celestial river in that region, which had appeared dimmer than it should, brightened to match the luminosity of surrounding areas. The visual signs of disturbance, small as they had been, disappeared entirely. The dragon's circling gradually widened as the need for his close presence diminished. He moved away from the center of what had been the disturbance, his spiral path expanding. His body no longer needed to directly redirect the flows, his positioning becoming less critical as the currents established stable patterns that would persist without his immediate support. But he did not leave entirely, not yet. Even though the acute phase of the disturbance had been resolved, even though balance had been restored to the immediate region, the dragon understood that newly established equilibria were more fragile than long-standing ones. The flows needed time to settle fully, to develop the kind of stability that came from repetition, from currents following the same paths over and over until those paths became deeply carved channels that resisted deviation. So the dragon remained nearby, no longer actively intervening but maintaining his presence as a stabilizing influence, as an anchor that helped the newly ordered flows resist any tendency to slip back toward turbulence. He positioned himself at the periphery of the region, his body parallel to the main current, his form adding mass and momentum to the flow, his presence discouraging the formation of any new eddies or instabilities. In this phase of his work, the dragon could relax slightly. The intense focus required for the active restoration was no longer necessary. He could allow his eyes to half close again, could permit his breathing to slow from the deliberate pace of intervention back toward the natural rhythm of restful awareness. His scales, which had been oriented with precise attention to deflecting currents, could relax into their natural configuration, responding to the flow rather than directing it. The dragon began to feel the satisfaction that came from work completed, from purpose fulfilled, from balance restored through appropriate effort applied with proper patience. This satisfaction was not pride. The dragon remained too fundamentally humble, too aligned with cosmic principles to experience ego, but it was a deep contentment, a sense of alignment between his nature and his actions, between what he was and what he did. Around him, the celestial river flowed smoothly once more. The currents that had been disturbed now moved in proper harmony with the currents around them. The region that had been a knot was now a seamless part of a larger pattern. Energy circulated efficiently, waste had been eliminated, and the cosmic order had been reinforced rather than compromised by the resolution of the disturbance. The stars shone steadily. The celestial water flowed clear and calm. The boundary between heaven and earth maintained its proper configuration. And in the world below, weather patterns continued their seasonal progressions without the minor deviations that had been beginning to appear. Crops grew under favorable conditions, rivers ran full but not flooding, and life proceeded in the blessed ignorance of mortals who had no idea that cosmic balance had been threatened and restored, that their continued prosperity had required intervention at levels they could never perceive. The dragon remained on watch, patient and vigilant, ensuring that the restoration remained stable, that no new disturbances emerged in the still sensitive region. He would remain here for a time, days, weeks, months perhaps, until he was certain that the equilibrium had solidified, that the flows had established patterns strong enough to resist minor perturbations, that his presence was no longer needed to maintain what had been restored. Only then would he return to his usual position in the depths, only then would he resume the stillness that was his natural state. Only then would he once again merge with the celestial river so completely that distinction between dragon and water nearly disappeared. But for now, he remained. Watching. Breathing. Being present. The work was complete, but the watchfulness never ended. The balance was restored, but the maintenance continued. The dragon had done what needed doing, and now he did what always needed doing. He remained, constant and patient, the eternal guardian of cosmic harmony, the tireless keeper of celestial peace. The celestial river flowed. The world below prospered. The dragon watched. And all was well once more. The dragon returns to stillness. Time passed, as time does, though in the realm where the dragon dwelt, its passage felt less like movement through successive moments and more like the gradual deepening of a single eternal now. The dragon remained at the periphery of the restored region, his presence a gentle anchor, his awareness spread through the celestial currents, monitoring the flows he had worked so carefully to re-establish. The patterns held. Day after day, measured by the world below, for the dragon himself experienced no such divisions, the currents continued in their proper configurations. The paths he had guided them into became grooves, then channels, then deep-carved courses that the water followed naturally, without needing to be directed. What had begun as tentative new patterns solidified into established flows, backed by the momentum of repetition, reinforced by the weight of accumulated passage. The dragon observed this solidification with the same patient attention he brought to all things. He watched as minor variations in the current, small fluctuations that might have grown into larger disturbances if the equilibrium had been fragile, instead dissipated harmlessly, absorbed by the stability of the larger pattern. He noted how the flows adjusted themselves automatically to small perturbations, how the system had developed the kind of resilience that came from proper balance, how the restoration he had facilitated was proving durable rather than temporary. This was good. This was as it should be. The dragon's intervention had not just fixed a problem but had strengthened the underlying pattern, had made the region more stable than it had been even before the disturbance occurred. His work had been not just restorative but improving, not just corrective but enhancing. The cosmic order was better for his effort, and this brought a deep satisfaction that needed no expression beyond the simple recognition of a thing done well. As the stability increased, the dragon began the slow process of withdrawal. Not a departure, exactly, but a gradual diminishing of his active presence, a gentle transition from vigilant monitoring to more passive awareness. He began to move, very slowly, away from the periphery of the restored region, his body flowing through the celestial currents with the same unhurried grace that characterized all his motion. The movement was barely perceptible, a displacement so gradual that no single moment showed any change from the moment before it. But accumulated over time, the motion carried him away from the region he had been guarding, moving him back toward the deeper parts of the celestial river, toward the hidden depths where he made his home, where his presence was less active intervention and more fundamental anchor. As he moved, he began to rise, ascending through the layers of existence that separated the world below from the pure celestial realm above. He passed back through the lower atmosphere, his body no longer influencing weather systems as dramatically as it had during his descent, his presence now so integrated with the natural flows that his passage created minimal disturbance. The clouds he passed through barely registered his movement, showing only the slightest shifts in their formations, the most subtle adjustments to their shapes. Rain that might have fallen earlier now held back, waiting for a more appropriate time, or fell in different locations where it was more needed. Winds that his earlier passage had calmed remained calm, having established patterns that persisted even as the cause of those patterns moved away. Higher still, the dragon rose through the realm of high clouds, those ice crystal formations that existed at the boundary between atmosphere and space. Here his passage was marked only by momentary glows, by brief sparkles as starlight caught on his jade scales and reflected in ways that the ice crystals magnified and scattered. Any mortal watching the sky at just the right moment might see unusual glimmers in the high clouds, might witness patterns of light that seemed almost purposeful before fading back into the ordinary scatter of illumination. But such observations were rare, and even when they occurred, they were ambiguous enough to be dismissed, to be categorized as natural phenomena with no deeper significance. The dragon's work remained hidden, his presence unrecognized, his influence attributed to the normal functioning of cosmic systems rather than to the efforts of any individual being. This was as it should be. The best guardianship was invisible guardianship, the most effective maintenance was maintenance that went unnoticed. The dragon continued his ascent, passing back through the boundary between terrestrial and celestial, between the realm where physical laws operated straightforwardly and the realm where those laws became more flexible, where possibility exceeded actuality, where the distinction between what was and what might be grew ambiguous. He moved through this liminal zone with ease, his nature allowing him to exist comfortably in both realms, to transition between them without the difficulty that mortal or purely divine beings would experience. And then he was back in the depths of the celestial river proper, in the hidden currents beneath the visible flow of stars, in the realm that was his true home. The celestial water welcomed him, or seemed to, the currents flowing around his body with a familiarity that suggested recognition, that implied a kind of relationship between the dragon and the medium through which he moved. The dragon began to slow his motion, began to settle into the currents rather than moving through them. His body, which had been extended in travel configuration, began to coil once more, drawing in upon itself, finding the comfortable arrangement that would allow him to rest while remaining aware, to be still while staying vigilant. The coiling was as gradual as everything else the dragon did, a process that unfolded over what would be days in the mortal world, each segment of his vast length finding its position, each curve nestling into its proper place. His tail, which had trailed behind him during his journey, now wrapped around his body, the fin at its tip coming to rest near his head, creating a circle, a completion, a form that symbolized wholeness even as it provided the most stable configuration for long-term stillness. The jade scales settled into their rest positions, their luminosity dimming slightly as the dragon's activity decreased, as his presence shifted from doing to simply being. His mane, which had flowed backward during his movement, now drifted in the gentle currents that remained, moving without his motion to propel it, responding to the natural flows of the celestial water. The strands arranged themselves in patterns that were both random and ordered, creating configurations that pleased the eye even though no eye was there to observe them, beauty existing for its own sake rather than for any witness. The dragon's breathing slowed. The cycles of inhalation and exhalation, which had been measured in minutes during his active work, now lengthened to hours, then to days, then to periods even longer, approaching the timeless rhythm that characterized his deepest rest. Each breath moved less water, stirred fewer currents, had diminishing effects on the world below. The mist that emerged from his exhalations became finer, more dispersed, nearly indistinguishable from the ordinary processes of evaporation and condensation that occurred constantly throughout the cosmos. His eyes, which had blazed with full intensity during his journey, began to dim. Not closing entirely, but returning to that half-lidded state that was his natural condition, that state where physical sight gave way to deeper perception, where active observation yielded to passive awareness. The moonlight color remained, but softer now, gentler, a glow rather than a blaze, sufficient to illuminate his immediate surroundings but not projecting far into the surrounding darkness. As the dragon settled deeper into stillness, his consciousness began to spread out again, diffusing through the celestial river's entire length. His awareness no longer focused on any particular region but distributed evenly throughout the whole. He could sense all the currents simultaneously, could feel the flow in every part of the river at once, could monitor countless patterns without concentrating specifically on any single one. This distributed awareness was his default state, the mode of consciousness he maintained during long periods of rest, the way he performed his guardian function without the need for constant active attention. It was a state between sleeping and waking, between action and rest, between focused alertness and diffuse peace. In this state, he could perceive anything that required his attention while remaining fundamentally at rest, could respond to disturbances if they arose while maintaining the stillness that was his nature. The position he had chosen for his rest was not precisely the same position he had occupied before his journey. The dragon never returned to exactly the same configuration, never replicated precisely a previous arrangement. Each rest was unique, each coiling slightly different from every other coiling. This variation was part of balance, part of the understanding that perfect repetition was impossible and undesirable, that each moment was unique even when it appeared similar to other moments. But the essential quality of his rest remained constant. The jade scales catching and holding light. The mane flowing in eternal currents. The eyes half closed in meditation. The breath moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, stirring the waters with patient rhythm. The body coiled in the depths, massive yet graceful, present yet unobtrusive, powerful yet peaceful. Around him, the celestial river continued its flow. The stars traced their paths across the night sky visible from the world below. The seasons turned in their reliable cycles. Weather patterns unfolded according to the balance that the dragon's presence helped maintain. Life continued in all its complexity and simplicity, all its struggle and grace, all its temporary intensity and its participation in eternal patterns. The dragon's work was complete, yet never complete. The disturbance had been addressed, yet vigilance remained necessary. The balance had been restored, yet maintaining it required constant presence. This was the paradox of the dragon's existence. His work was both finished and ongoing, both accomplished and continuing, both a specific task completed and a general function that never ended. In his rest, the dragon embodied this paradox without experiencing it as contradiction. He was still, yet attentive. He was inactive, yet working. He was at peace, yet serving. These apparent opposites were not in conflict but in harmony, different aspects of the same fundamental reality, different expressions of the same essential truth. The dragon coiled in the depths beneath the celestial river, his jade-scaled body merging once again with the flowing darkness, his presence becoming indistinguishable from the medium he inhabited, his consciousness spread throughout the cosmic system he existed to maintain. He had returned to stillness, but it was not the stillness of absence or the stillness of nothing. It was the stillness of perfect presence, of complete awareness, of fundamental peace that could contain all motion while remaining unmoved. His eyes half closed. His breath slowed. His body settled into rest. The celestial river flowed above him, around him, through him. The stars shone steadily. The world below turned through its cycles. The dragon watched without watching, worked without working, maintained balance through the simple fact of his existence. The guardian had returned to his post. The keeper had resumed his watch. The anchor had settled back into position. All was as it should be. All was in balance. All was peaceful. The dragon rested, and in his resting, he worked. The dragon was still, and in his stillness, he moved. The dragon slept, and in his sleeping, he remained awake. This was his nature. This was his purpose. This was his gift to the cosmos. Stillness. Watchfulness. Peace. Eternal and unchanging, yet responsive and adaptive. Present always, yet never imposing. The dragon of peace returned to his place beneath the celestial river, where he had always been, where he would always be, where his presence ensured that the cosmic order could continue, that balance could be maintained, that the great patterns could unfold as they should. Coiled in the depths. Eyes half closed. Breathing slowly. Watching. Waiting. Being. Forever. The legend beneath the night sky. And so the story returns to where it began, to the night sky above the world, to the celestial river flowing in its luminous band across the darkness, to the stars that have watched over the earth since the beginning of time and will continue watching until time itself concludes, if conclusion there ever is to be. The river flows above you now, whether you can see it in this moment or must imagine it. It stretches from horizon to horizon, that great pathway of light, that collection of countless stars so numerous that together they appear as flowing radiance. The same river that has always been there, that your ancestors looked upon, that their ancestors before them gazed at in wonder, that future generations will study and marvel at long after this particular night has passed into memory and then beyond memory into the vast forgetting that claims all moments eventually. But the river is more than what eyes can see. This you know now, having followed the story through its unfolding, having accompanied the dragon on his journey from stillness to movement and back to stillness again. The visible stars are merely the surface, the manifestation in mortal realm of depths that extend beyond perception, currents that flow through dimensions that eyes cannot track, patterns that operate according to principles that exceed ordinary understanding. Beneath that visible flow, in depths that exist between the realm you inhabit and the pure celestial realm beyond, the dragon rests. His vast body coiled through currents that are more idea than substance, more pattern than matter. His jade scales catching light that comes from no visible source, reflecting it in ways that create the very stars you see, or perhaps being reflected by those stars. The relationship between cause and effect growing ambiguous in realms where time flows differently than it does in the world of solid things and linear progression. The dragon watches, though his eyes remain half closed. He breathes, though his breath moves too slowly to be called breathing by any mortal measure. He maintains balance, though the maintaining requires no effort, no strain, simply the fact of his presence, the reality of his existence anchoring the patterns that allow all other existence to continue. You cannot see him. No mortal eye can penetrate the depths where he dwells. But perhaps, if you are very still, if you quiet your mind and open your awareness to subtleties that normally go unnoticed, you can sense his presence. Not as something specific, not as a clear perception, but as a quality in the air, a character in the night, a feeling of being watched over that has no obvious source yet persists nonetheless. The dragon asks nothing of you. He does not require worship or acknowledgement. He does not need prayers or offerings. His work continues whether mortals know of him or not, whether they believe in him or dismiss him as legend, whether they tell stories about him around their fires or forget entirely that such stories ever existed. The cosmic balance does not depend on human recognition. The dragon's purpose remains fulfilled through his mere existence, through his patient presence in the depths, through his endless vigilance that never wavers and never tires. But knowing the story changes something, doesn't it? Even if the knowing changes nothing about the dragon's work, nothing about the cosmic patterns, nothing about the flow of celestial currents or the maintenance of balance between heaven and earth, even if the external reality remains unchanged, something internal shifts. The night sky becomes more than just distant lights. The stars become more than astronomical objects. The darkness between the stars becomes less empty, less void, filled instead with possibility, with hidden depths, with the presence of a guardian whose work makes all life possible. You lie here now, perhaps in your bed, perhaps elsewhere, but somewhere in the world that the dragon watches over, and the night surrounds you. The darkness that seems so vast, so indifferent, so uncaring about the small concerns of individual lives. But beneath that apparent indifference, there flows a deeper current. The dragon's peace, radiating outward from his resting place, influencing the world in ways too subtle to be noticed yet profound enough to be essential. The air you breathe has been touched by his breath, has passed through systems that his presence helps regulate, that his vigilance keeps balanced. The weather that shapes your days flows from patterns that his work maintains. The seasons that structure your years turn according to cycles that his eternal watchfulness protects from disruption. You live within systems that the dragon guards, systems so fundamental that their smooth operation goes unnoticed, that their stability is taken for granted, that their reliability seems like the natural state of things rather than the result of constant maintenance. This is how it should be. The dragon does not seek credit for his work. The best protection is protection that goes unrecognized. The most effective guardianship is guardianship that allows those protected to live without awareness of threat, without concern for underlying mechanisms, without the burden of understanding all the forces that must remain balanced for life to continue. So the dragon remains hidden, and you remain unaware, and life proceeds in its ordinary complexity, and all of this is good, all of this is right, all of this is as the cosmic order intends it to be. But tonight, having heard the story, you carry a different awareness. Not knowledge exactly, for the story is legend, is myth, is narrative rather than scientific fact. But something deeper than knowledge, something that operates at levels where fact and metaphor merge, where literal truth and symbolic truth become indistinguishable, where what is real and what is meaningful occupy the same space. You know now that the night sky holds secrets, that the stars form patterns with purpose, that the darkness is not empty but full, not silent but singing in frequencies too low for ears to detect, not cold but warm with attention that extends from celestial depths to encompass your small, particular existence on this small, particular planet. The dragon watches, and in watching, protects. Not just you specifically, not just this moment individually, but all moments, all beings, all the intricate web of existence that depends on balance for its continuation. His peace extends outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, like light radiating from a source, like breath expanding to fill available space. And perhaps, lying here in the darkness, feeling the weight of blankets or the touch of air on your skin, perhaps you can imagine yourself connected to those ripples, touched by that light, breathed upon by that ancient breath. Perhaps you can conceive of yourself as part of the great pattern that the dragon maintains, as one small but significant thread in the tapestry of existence that his work helps weave. The thought is comforting, isn't it? To imagine that the universe is not indifferent, that some vast benevolent presence watches over the world, that chaos is kept at bay not by accident but by design, by the patient work of a being whose nature is peace, whose purpose is balance, whose existence is dedicated to ensuring that life can flourish, that patterns can continue, that the cosmic order remains stable enough to support all the small, temporary, precious lives that unfold within it. The dragon does not promise that life will be easy. He does not guarantee that suffering will not occur, that loss will not be experienced, that difficulty will not arise. These things are part of existence, part of the pattern, part of the balance that includes both joy and sorrow, growth and decay, beginning and ending. The dragon maintains the framework within which life unfolds, but he does not control the specific content of individual lives. But he ensures that the framework remains stable, that the seasons will continue to turn, that rain will fall when it is needed, that the sun will rise each morning, that the fundamental patterns upon which all life depends will not be disrupted by cosmic-scale catastrophes, by imbalances so severe that recovery becomes impossible, by chaos so complete that order cannot reassert itself. This is his gift. This is his service. This is the peace he offers, not the peace of life without challenge, but the peace of knowing that the underlying systems remain sound, that the foundation stays solid, that the cosmic order continues its ancient patterns regardless of whatever difficulties might arise in the smaller scale of individual experience. And knowing this, understanding this, carrying this awareness even as sleep approaches, perhaps you can rest more easily. Perhaps you can release the tensions of the day more completely, can let go of worries more fully, can surrender to the natural cycle of waking and sleeping with greater trust that when you wake, the world will still be there, the patterns will have held, the balance will have been maintained. The dragon watches over your sleeping as he watches over everything. Not because you are special, though you are, in the way that every individual existence is unique and irreplaceable, but because watching is his nature, because vigilance is his function, because maintaining balance includes maintaining the conditions that allow you to rest safely, to dream peacefully, to wake refreshed into a world that continues to turn, to grow, to be. Your breathing slows now, matching perhaps the slow rhythm of the dragon's breath, though his breath is so slow that matching it is impossible, that synchronization can only be approximate, that connection can only be metaphorical. But metaphor has its own truth, its own reality, its own way of making meaning from the vast meaninglessness of pure physical process. Breathe in, slowly, deeply. Feel the air enter your lungs, feel it nourish your body, feel it connect you to the atmosphere that surrounds the earth, to the weather systems that the dragon influences, to the cosmic currents that flow through all of existence. Breathe out, slowly, completely. Feel the breath leave your body, feel the tension release, feel yourself settle more deeply into rest, into the peace that the dragon embodies, into the stillness that underlies all motion. The celestial river flows above you, unchanging in its essential nature, infinite in its subtle variations. The stars follow their ancient paths, bright points in the darkness, lanterns on the water of night. The dragon coils in the depths beneath the visible flow, his jade scales catching starlight, his half-closed eyes perceiving everything, his breath stirring currents that will eventually manifest as wind on your face, as rain on your roof, as the gentle progression of seasons that structure your life. All is well. All is balanced. All is as it should be. The guardian watches. The river flows. The stars shine steadily. And you rest, held in a peace older than mountains, deeper than oceans, more vast than the sky itself, yet intimate enough to touch this particular moment, this particular breath, this particular transition from waking into sleep. The story ends, but the dragon continues. The telling concludes, but the watching never stops. The words cease, but the peace remains, flowing like the river, shining like the stars, present like the darkness that makes all light visible. Rest now. The dragon watches. All is well. All has always been well. All will always be well. The celestial river flows above you, luminous and eternal, carrying within its depths the dragon who guards the balance, who maintains the peace, who ensures through his patient presence that the cosmic order continues, that life can flourish, that you can rest here safely, held in a protection you cannot see but which surrounds you nonetheless, invisible but absolute, silent but singing in frequencies that your heart recognizes even if your ears cannot perceive them. Rest. Peace. Balance. The dragon's gifts, freely given, constantly maintained, eternally present. The night sky above. The earth below. And between them, in the depths beneath the stars, the dragon coils in peaceful vigilance, watching over all, disturbing nothing, maintaining everything. Forever. And you sleep, beneath his watchful gaze, safe in the peace he embodies, held in the balance he maintains, blessed by a guardianship you never knew you needed but which has been there always, will be there always, is there now. The celestial river flows. The dragon watches. The peace endures. All is well.